Κυρίες και κύριοι, καλησπέρα σας. Εκ μέρους του Ινστιτούτου Δημοκρατίας Κωνσταντίνος Καραμανλής, σας καλωσορίζω στην απόψινή διάλεξη του κορυφαίου ιστορικού και διανοητή, καθηγητή στα πανεπιστήμια Harvard και Stanford, Niall Ferguson, τον οποίο θα προσφωνήσει ο πρόεδρος της Νέας Δημοκρατίας και αρχηγός της αξιωματικής αντιπολίτευσης, κ. Κυριάκος Μητσοτάκης. Θα μου επιτρέψετε να συνεχίσω στα αγγλικά, όπως άλλωστε προβλέπετε από το πρόγραμμα. Your Excellencies, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to tonight's event with Professor Niall Ferguson, a top historian and thinker of our times. His lecture, entitled The Trump Presidency's First 6 Weeks and What It Means for Europe, is being hosted by the Konstantinos Karamanlis Institute for Democracy in this wonderful auditorium, and I would like to thank the National Bank of Greece for offering it to us. It is my great honor and a pleasure as the director of the Institute for Democracy, but also as a historian myself, to warmly welcome Niall Ferguson and express our deep gratitude to him for gladly accepting to give a public lecture before such a distinguished audience. As you all well know, Niall Ferguson is a senior fellow at two world-famous academic institutions, the University of Harvard and the University of Stanford, thus looking into history and international politics from both US coasts. His global outlook owes also much to his strong European academic and political background, as an outstanding analyst of European history, not to mention as a Scot in the UK. Among his many virtues, I would like to stress his unique passion for historical research that links past, present, and future, thus making history and historiography relevant to all, through his many books, speeches, and documentaries. As Niall Ferguson is committed to excellence and innovative political thinking, there could be no better introduction to his speech than by a political leader who shares the same values and promotes them daily in his political actions and decisions. This is Mr. Kyriakos Mitsotakis, President of Nea Demokratia and leader of the Greek opposition. Mr. Mitsotakis, thank you for having accepted our invitation for tonight's event, and please take the podium. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are indeed very fortunate to welcome Niall Ferguson to Greece and the Konstantinos Karamanlis Institute for Democracy. Niall Ferguson is a distinguished academic. He was the Lawrence Tisch Professor at Harvard before he was lured to the West Coast for reasons which I totally understand, where he's currently the senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's also, of course, an acclaimed author, a columnist, a filmmaker, as well as the recipient of many prizes and awards that include the Benjamin Franklin Prize for Public Service and the Hayek Prize for Lifetime Achievement. Now it's a great honor and pleasure to have you with us today. And there is no question about it. 6 weeks into the Trump presidency, and it is very clear that it is not business as usual in Washington, in the United States, and for that matter, the rest of the world. And I could not have thought of a better person than Niall Ferguson to tackle these first few weeks of the Trump presidency and what this all means for Europe. And by the looks of the crowd that is gathered here today, it seems I'm not the only one. Although I must admit that some of us might have expected something else the other day I had an ecstatic member of my staff come up to me and ask me, how on earth did you manage to get Sir Alex Ferguson to come and speak in Greece? Well, we have another Scot, and Man United fans aside, thank you so much for honoring us with your presence. Last Tuesday, President Trump, in his first address to the joint sessions of Congress, outlined what I thought was a very measured and to a large extent systemic roadmap for his domestic and his foreign policy initiatives. He, for example, stated emphatically that the US strongly supports NATO. Nonetheless, the most interesting caveat to the importance of the transatlantic partnership came when he said that we will respect historic institutions, referring to NATO, but we will also respect the sovereign rights of nations, directly urging US allies to take a more direct and meaningful role in both strategic and military operations. The real question, however, remains: what are the true intentions of the new US president towards transatlantic institutions and towards the European Union? Are the very pillars of the post-war economic and security establishment being challenged by a new revisionist policy that puts America first? Or will the new president make the necessary adjustment to political realism under the influence of the traditional Republican foreign policy establishment? Looking at America today from our shores, a lot of Europeans have a right to be concerned about statements that promote a new American new isolationism. They have right to be concerned about issues related to economic nationalism, and of course they have reasons to be concerned about statements that predict the demise of the European Union and the breakup of the Eurozone. Concerns aside, I personally believe that it is way too premature to say that the post-war economic and security arrangement is being questioned. And I would certainly caution all those who have already begun doubting the strength of the system of checks and balances that is at the core of the American democratic system. But Niall, insights on these issues will certainly be invaluable. Ladies and gentlemen, this lecture today is being organized by the Karamanlis Institute for Democracy. Konstantinos Karamanlis founded Nea Demokratia back in 1974 after the collapse of the military junta, and based his political theory on two fundamental pillars. First, a commitment to unselfish political realism, and second, a commitment that Greece will remain at the center of the project of European integration. And I'm sure that if he were with us today, he would reassert both of these premises more strongly than before. I'm not so sure, however, that he would assess the current state, how he would assess the current state of the grand post-war European project. And this is a very important question for us, not only in light of certain statements that have been made from the other side of the Atlantic that question the very utility of the European Union, but because the truth is that the state of the European Union has reached a very dramatic crossroad. And if anything, Brexit and the wave of post-truth politics on the continent have made it abundantly clear that there is a deep, very deep, and quite frequently justified disconnect between the citizens of EU member states and the national and European elites. The forces of populism and nationalism are on the rise. Traditional establishment parties are being threatened by insurgents that emerge from the fringes of the political spectrum. But most profoundly, economic inequality, the forces of globalization, of technological upheaval, are creating a sense of justified, but also of profound uneasiness for many who feel deeply isolated and left behind. And Greece was at the forefront of this trend to challenge the political establishment. We have suffered an economic crisis of momentous proportions. Relationships of trust between traditional political elites and citizens have been shattered and need to be rebuilt. And consequently, we were the first country to elect into power a true populist movement that won 2 national elections on a platform of brazen lies and unrealistic promises. Populists, whether they originate from the left or whether they originate from the right, are notoriously bad at managing real-life problems. They are, however, much more effective at eroding democratic institutions. And it should be thus no surprise that 2 years after the first Syriza victory, we are in a much worse state than we were back in January 2015. And to this day, despite hundreds of billions of bailout packages, series of missteps, instead of truly taking ownership of a comprehensive, pro-growth, pro-reform agenda that will allow Greece to stand again on its 2 feet, the government and our creditors are again negotiating further recessionary measures, and I'm afraid that the can is again being kicked down the road. And I wouldn't call Greece an example of common European fortitude. What Greece badly needs, what Greece bitterly needs, is a government that will assume true ownership of the reforms that are necessary to establish a competitive economy and a properly functioning public administration. And trust can only be restored by speaking the language of truth. And facts and rational arguments are the only answer to the world of post-truth politics. It is very clear that we in Greece need to put our own house in order. But we also need to convince our creditors that a policy of prolonged austerity will be detrimental not only for us, but also for them. Greece was the first country that was taken over by the false lure and promises of this most recent version of populism. We could also be the first country where the populist insurgency will suffer a bitter electoral defeat. And that is why, and let me conclude with this remark, what happens in Greece is very relevant for the rest of Europe and, of course, very relevant for the relationship of Europe with the United States. With this, please allow me to call upon Niall Ferguson to take the podium, and let me thank again the Karamanlis Institute for organizing this very special event. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Kyriakos. It's always a pleasure to be introduced by a future Prime Minister. I was remembering my last lecture here in this city that I gave, it turns out, 7 years ago. The lecture had the title of Financial Greek Tragedy and a European Farce. One never remembers one's own lectures, so I took a quick look to see what I'd said on my last excursion here, and there was a nice report. Niall Ferguson, it reads, stated that, quote, the Greek bailout was a bailout of the German and French banks. Ferguson argued that austerity measures without incentives for growth will be insufficient to get Greece out of its current financial predicament, and said that Greece is trying to achieve a huge fiscal adjustment in an excruciatingly short period of time. Consequently, he spoke about the need of all European states and the US to gradually extend their debt maturity periods through some conversion mechanism. The economic historian identified the reform of state institutions and the implementation of the rule of law as necessary conditions for investor confidence and growth. Not bad. The depressing thing is that 7 years later, those predictions that austerity would impose crushing costs on the Greek economy have not only been proved true, but still apply. And my appeal then for healthy institutions and the rule of law as the sound basis for growth is a great deal more urgent politically now than it was then. Well, having established my credibility as a Cassandra, I may now turn my attention to the country where I now reside. And doubtless some of you will be wondering if my outlook for the United States in 2017 is as pessimistic as my outlook for Greece was in 2010. There's certainly enough pessimism to go round about the United States since the election of Donald J. Trump as president in the small hours of November the 9th last year. As you'll know if you spend any time in the United States, especially if you spend that time on the coasts, the liberal elites of the media and academia are still in a state of shock that Donald Trump is their president. There are supposed to be 5 stages of grief. Most columnists in the New York Times haven't got to stage 2 yet. But I want to ask a question that will strike you as optimistic. My question is it morning in America again? That was the phrase made famous by Ronald Reagan's television ad when he was seeking re-election. Morning in America with Trump as president? Most Europeans would respond. Surely it's more like twilight in America. And the Prince of Darkness standing to Donald Trump's left in this photograph is, of course, Steve Bannon, his chief strategist, a man that the liberal media have been trying their very best to smear and discredit since he burst onto the American political scene in the election campaign last year. There are serious people whom I respect who worry that the United States has turned down the road of fascism. If you want to know what the United States would be like under a fascist regime, there are 2 novels available to help you picture the scene. And I show them here. Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here and Philip Roth's The Plot Against America. It Can't Happen Here was published in 1935 and is a brilliant imagining of what would happen if a demagogue, he's called Buzz Windrip in the novel, somehow became president. In Philip Roth's imaginary America, it's the aviator Charles Lindbergh who becomes president and turns out to be, as I think he probably was, a fascist as well as an isolationist. One of my oldest friends, Andrew Sullivan, wrote a terrifying essay in the New York magazine with the title, "America Has Never Been So Ripe for Tyranny." He is by no means alone. Eminent academics have been drawing analogies with the 1930s, whether in Italy or Germany, to warn that Americans have inadvertently elected a tyrant, a fascist, to the presidency. Well, I think this is all pretty much wrong. And it consists largely of a category error. And the category error is to confuse fascism with populism. As we just heard from our future Prime Minister, populism is something unpleasant, certainly, malignant, potentially, but it's not to be confused with fascism. Fascism involves the brazen overthrow of democratic constitutions. It involves the wearing of uniforms and usually black boots. Fascism is about war, ultimately. Populism is not like that and shouldn't be confused with that. And the wave of populism that we saw in the Western world and beyond last year, I think, is simply not to be understood in terms of the 1930s. In fact, I've argued elsewhere that we should look further back in time to understand this backlash against free trade, against free migration, against big finance. This backlash that we see today is a familiar echo of an earlier backlash that began in the 1870s and produced populist leaders on both sides of the Atlantic, whose objectives were very familiar in today's political terms: protectionism, restrictions on immigration, restrictions on business. The populist rhetoric of today is much closer to the populist rhetoric of the 1870s and the 1880s than it is to anything that happened in the 1930s. It is important to understand that populism, like some ice cream, comes in two flavors. Neither pleasant. There is the populism of the right, which gave us Brexit and gave us Trump. But then there is the populism of the left that the Greek people decided to take a chance on. And I don't want us to confuse these things because they arrive at very different policy prescriptions, even if their critique of a global financial order is sometimes rather similar in its language. When Donald Trump wowed American crowds last year by insisting again and again that he would build a wall, a great, great wall, along the US-Mexican border, he was echoing an earlier campaign for immigration restriction, which, in this cartoon here, involved building a metaphorical wall. That campaign in the 1870s was for the exclusion of Chinese immigrants to the United States. It began with obscure demagogues like Dennis Kearney in California chanting "the Chinese must go," and it culminated with the 1882 Exclusion Act and a whole succession of measures after that that significantly limited immigration to the United States. It is a cliché of American political discourse that the United States is a land of immigrants. It is simply not true that the United States has always based itself on free immigration. From 1882 right down to the middle of the 20th century, immigration to the United States was highly restricted, and the Chinese were only the first of many groups to find themselves unwelcome in America. So we should not be surprised that a populist should win votes by arguing for immigration restriction. I'm sorry, this is in America's political DNA, as this cartoon well illustrates. The challenge in understanding the United States under Donald Trump is to separate the noise from the signal. And what I want to try and do this evening is to help you get the signal by stripping away the noise of 24/7 media hysteria. There is a kind of strange feedback loop between President Trump's Twitter account and the liberal media. The media like making news about themselves the way Hollywood likes to make pictures about itself. You've got to ignore it, it's mostly noise. You have to ask yourself, what is this populist president actually going to do? And that's what I want to focus on. Because when you look at what he intends to do, based not just on tweets, but on speeches, including his inaugural address, you see that it's not so very unreasonable, at least some of it. He wants to raise the growth rate of the American economy, which unquestionably has been below its historic averages since the financial crisis of 2008. And he wants to more than double that growth rate if he can, not just by protectionism, something that he certainly has threatened, but also through tax reform and deregulation. Secondly, on foreign policy, President Trump has repudiated the neoconservative vision of an America capable of democratizing the world, if necessary at gunpoint, but has equally condemned the foreign policy failures of the Obama administration. A list of failures of that administration would really consume the rest of the time I have for this lecture. As someone who regularly criticized the Obama administration for its foreign policy, I couldn't be happier that most of its central strategic objectives are being abandoned by the president. And as the biographer of Henry Kissinger, I must say I'm glad to hear that there will be a realism in American foreign policy in which the national interest, rather than some grand ideology, will take precedence. And when President Trump says that his only real exception to that principle is his goal to eradicate radical Islamic terrorism from the face of the earth, I, for one, applaud him. That seems to me a goal on which we should all be able to agree. So when you ask yourself what is actually being proposed here, and look at the detail of the policies that are likely to be implemented, the hysteria of the protests against Trump that we've seen more or less from the moment of his election seems misplaced. And I certainly struggle to take seriously many of the things that are said by protesters, including, I'm afraid to say, the well-known singer Madonna. Why am I more sympathetic than the average rock star to President Trump? Well, I think it's because I sympathize with his voters. Whatever you may think of Trump as an individual, if you ask yourself what drove people to vote for him, to prefer him to Hillary Clinton, it seems to me that the answer's clear. For those Americans who live in the heart of the country, not in the bubbles of privilege on the coasts, the last 20 years have been a deeply disillusioning time. As this chart shows, in real terms, the average household income didn't just flatline, it actually plunged downwards and has not yet recovered to the level that it was in 1999. Labour force participation in the United States has fallen strikingly further than in any other comparable developed economy. especially for prime-age male workers. This chart, which shows the United States in a dotted green line, tells you something's wrong. And if you're still not convinced, take a look at this. Angus Deaton, the Princeton Nobel laureate, published a paper last year showing that while mortality rates in all developed countries have been trending downwards, for middle-aged white Americans, that has ceased to be the case. And if you look on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see perhaps the most striking chart of last year, which revealed an epidemic of premature mortality amongst middle-aged non-Hispanic whites, including a spike in suicides and a really alarming increase in deaths related to overdoses of drugs and alcohol. My old friend Charles Murray and I were in Washington earlier this week debating what he called in his wonderful book, Coming Apart, the sociological origins of the Trump phenomenon. From the vantage point of Middle America, by 2016, the status quo had become unendurable and Hillary Clinton simply offered more of the same. I likened the choice in the election to a choice between two World War II acronyms, SNAFU and FUBAR. Hillary Clinton stood for situation normal, all effed up. SNAFU. But Donald Trump offered you effed up beyond all recognition, FUBAR. And for many Americans, like my friends Mike and Jerry, it was worth risking FUBAR just to avoid SNAFU, to avoid another 4 years of this. And I respect their decision. I was not a Trump supporter. I was late, very late, to the Trump party. But by the late summer of last year, I realized that Mike and Jerry were right and the liberal elites of Martha's Vineyard were wrong. It was worth taking a chance to get away from a broken status quo. If you don't think America needs tax reform, you've never lived there. The United States has an entirely dysfunctional tax system, whether you look at income tax or, as here, corporate tax. It is a truly astonishing phenomenon that the United States has the top marginal corporate tax rate in the developed world. And I could give you multiple illustrations of the point that the fiscal system of the United States is broken. Actually, I was arguing this 4 years ago, 5 years now, in a book called The Great Degeneration. And as for deregulation, again, if you don't think the US economy is overregulated, you've never tried to do business there. Trust me, because I've done it, it's easier to start a small business in Old England than in New England. And no presidency in the history of the United States did more to add regulatory burdens to US business than the presidency of Barack Obama. When President Trump argues that other NATO members do not sufficiently contribute to the alliance, he is 100% right. Nor is he the first president to make this argument. Actually, presidents since Richard Nixon have been saying this, and it's only got more true over time, as this recent chart from The Economist shows. By the way, well done, Greece. The outlier in the European pacifist race. And I think shame on Germany. Germany now has a defense budget in relation to its vast economy as low as the defense budget that was imposed on it under the terms of the Versailles Treaty of 1919, except this is voluntary. Considering the magnitude of the security crises that the European Union likely will face in the coming years, it is an outrage that the Germans free ride in this way, expect the United States to pick up the tab, and then whine hypocritically about everything they don't like about American power. Sorry, I've really had enough of that, Berlin. So let me, having made the case that a Trump presidency was needed and will be salutary for all the obvious flaws of the individual and all the question marks that undoubtedly hang over relations between his campaign and the Russian government, let me ask, what are the real obstacles to the Trump presidency being successful? Because we need to focus on these and not on Madonna or any other entertainment light figure. I'm going to give you 4 serious challenges that Trump will confront in the coming weeks and months, and offer an assessment as to whether he and his administration will be able to overcome these obstacles. The first is merely buyer's remorse. He is very clearly the most unpopular new president since opinion polls began. And that is partly because many of the independents and undecideds who broke for Trump in the final weeks of last year's election campaign almost immediately regretted doing it. The phenomenon known as buyer's remorse. If you compare the trajectory of presidential approval for all presidents for which we have data, not only does Donald Trump start at the bottom, he sinks further in the first weeks of his presidency than any president in recorded history. This seems a meaningful headwind. Populists, you see, always have the problem that their voters are fickle. If you've once defected from a political establishment to a populist, there's very little to stop you defecting from the populist if he does not deliver. And this is a fundamental problem for a man who cares deeply about opinion polls. The second problem that Mr. Trump has to worry about is his relationship with the party whose candidate he became. There is no love lost between Donald Trump and some key figures in the Republican Party in Congress. If I had to pick one who hates his guts, it would be John McCain. And I would certainly be concerned, as Donald Trump, about the implacable vengeance in John McCain's mind as he contemplates the coming weeks. In some ways, it's an advantage to have Republican majorities in both the House and the Senate. But it's not an advantage if those Republican majorities are not loyal to the president personally. Now, if you really think about it, and that relies on this thing working, which it's not doing. Why is it not working? You know what's happened? It's when the antivirus software decides that it's time to stop talking and do a complete system reboot. Bear with me. This never happens to Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump does not use PowerPoint. I was just in Washington with the man who loves to use PowerPoint, Paul Ryan. And it occurred to me as I listened to Paul talk that actually he's not just the Speaker of the House, he's the Prime Minister. And the way to think about this administration is that Donald Trump is king and Paul Ryan is Prime Minister. What you didn't know if you were listening to Trump's Tuesday night speech was that everything that he said had already been said at lunchtime that day by Paul Ryan in front of an audience of Hoover Institution supporters, board members, and fellows. All the key points of the Trump speech were in Paul Ryan's presentation to us, and Ryan made it very clear that in 200 days, these will be the legislative priorities. Number 1, deregulation. Number 2, repeal and replacement of Obamacare. And number 3, comprehensive tax reform of both income and corporate tax, done at high speed using the device known in Congress as reconciliation to override the opposition of the Democrats. Trump's fate as president hinges much more on the success of the Republicans in Congress than he himself may realize. Or maybe he's slowly come to realize it, and that explains why the positions have gradually converged. Most of the legislative agenda that we now see in the United States is authored by Paul Ryan, Kevin McCarthy, Devin Nunes, the senior Republicans in the House. The only thing that's really Trumpian is the infrastructure project, and it remains to be seen whether that will ever really get far off the ground. The third of my 4 headwinds is the one that will appeal to the more economically minded people in the room. It's the simple fact that no major economic institution in the world thinks that Donald Trump can double the US growth rate. Not one of them. Not the Fed, which expects the US economy to grow by between 1.9 and 2.3% this year. Not the IMF, which is a tiny bit more optimistic. Not Goldman Sachs. None of them. And that is, it seems to me, a very fundamental problem for a president who sold himself as the jobs president, who tweeted only today about not only the stock market's performance, but the economy's performance, even about his relatively better performance in terms of the federal debt. This is all pretty risky if the economy doesn't come through. What does Trump have going for him? Confidence, animal spirits. One thing about November the 9th, 2016, that really strikes me as interesting is that even as economists and academics and Hollywood stars were melting down, predicting the end of civilization, small business all across America woke up to a glad, confident new morning in which tax reform and, even more importantly, deregulation were finally actually doable. The relief American businessmen felt at not having Hillary Clinton as the next president of the United States is there in that chart. The big question is, will that surge of confidence turn into a surge of investment, or will it peter out in uncertainty about what exactly the various reforms will look like? Not to get too technical, but I'm going to do it anyway, let me explain what seems to me the biggest risk of the Trump administration. And you as Greeks will understand exactly what I'm going to talk about. Because you're not the only people in the world with a pretty big debt. And you're not the only people in the world who have to do some very heavy lifting to stabilize your public finances. The United States has only one real big advantage over you. It's not in a monetary union with the Germans. When you look at the trajectory of the US federal debt, even before Trump's election, using this chart from the Congressional Budget Office, you see the problem. There is a scenario in which the debt goes very rapidly up to exactly where your debt level is in the space of maybe 20 years. If that scenario were to materialize, then I think Donald Trump would have both a political as well as an economic problem. Those lines could go a lot steeper if the tax reforms get bungled, and they could be. If, for example, the much-debated border adjustment tax does not pass through Congress, there will be a $1 trillion hole in the Republican tax reform plan. And those lines could start looking a lot steeper the next time the Congressional Budget Office does its projections. That's what scares me. And it scares me, God, it's happened again. It is, of course, a PC. No Mac would treat me this way. What really scares me is that even as the risk exists of the deficit blowing out and the debt trajectory steepening, there's this thing called the Federal Reserve. You remember those people who used to be the most dovish central bankers in the world, right up until about 3 a.m. on November the 9th, 2016, and then suddenly they became like super hawkish. No, we really have to raise rates. We were just kidding last year. This year we mean it. Because if we don't, there's going to be some inflationary risk. Janet Yellen and Donald Trump are destined for a Twitter war. And that Twitter war is probably only a matter of weeks away. As the Fed hikes rates, it seems to me it's going to become a problem for Donald Trump, especially if markets get jittery about the tax reforms. Let me say one last thing about the headwinds Donald Trump faces, and then turn finally to what it means for Europe. It is an extraordinary state of affairs when the President of the United States argues in his inaugural address for protection, and the President of the People's Republic of China goes to Davos to defend free trade. But that is what happened in January. If there was one thing that really alarmed me in December, it was the prospect of a full-blown trade war between the United States and China, and maybe even a war of the real kind over the South China Sea. Many of the early signals of the Trump administration were aggressively anti-Chinese. And that, of course, elicited this rather clever response from Xi Jinping at Davos. Some of you may even have been there. I dare say Mr. Tsipras was at Davos. I saw him there enjoying himself last year, certainly. The trouble with protectionism is, and there's a lot of history to support this position, it doesn't work. If you don't believe me, ask Goldman Sachs. Every single report that Goldman has published since the election has made it clear that a trade war between the US and China would be a disaster economically for everybody, especially, in fact, the United States, as these charts that I've grabbed from Goldman show fairly clearly. You don't need to know much except that those lines go very unpleasantly downwards in the case of the trade war scenario, and in the bigger chart to the left, it's the US line that goes down furthest. But of course, Goldman Sachs has a certain amount of influence over Donald Trump, since Gary Cohn, who used to co-run the bank, is now one of his chief economic advisor. And Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary with whom I dined the other night, also used to be at Goldman Sachs. And come to think of it, so did the Prince of Darkness, Steve Bannon. So it's kind of unlikely that Donald Trump hasn't heard the economic downside risk of protectionism, which is why I suspect that we'll see, after presumably some more rhetoric, not a trade war, but a major trade deal of some sort between the United States and China. This is now the thing I worry the least about. In sum, The Art of the Deal, a book that you should all read if you want to understand the most powerful man in the world, has met its match. And its match is the house of cards that is Washington politics. you can sense with every passing day the normalization process taking its course. And I am confident that that normalization of the Trump administration will continue with occasional Twitter storms to excite the media. On the night of the American election, this mural appeared in Moscow. A rather socialist realist Donald Trump in the middle of the triptych, an outsized and utterly terrifying Vladimir Putin to the right, and yes, that is Marine Le Pen to the left. The first big question we need to address as we think about the implications of Trump for Europe is, will 2017 be like 2016? Will the populists win against expectations and in defiance of opinion polls and all right-thinking people in the media? We can't rule it out. The most important insight that I can offer tonight on the subject of politics, and I offer it to you too, Kyriakos, is that no matter what the opinion polls say, in the modern world, all elections are 50-50 until the results come out. And you should never be overconfident going into an election the way Hillary Clinton was overconfident, the way David Cameron was overconfident about his referendum. Politics in the modern world is 50-50. It's really close. Anybody who tells you that Monsieur Macron will be the next president with a probability of 90% because look at these polls is a half-wit who's learnt nothing from last year. It's going to be close. However, that means that there is an even chance of a quite different outcome from the domino theory prediction, which says that Geert Wilders and Marine Le Pen and heaven knows Alternative for Deutschland will carry the day in 2017. Let's just assume that there's a 50-50 chance that Europe goes completely the other way. And I think that will create a very interesting conjuncture from the vantage point of Greece. The sequencing is certainly going to be important here. In a scenario in which Macron, who's sort of created a political party in the time that it takes me to make my breakfast, becomes the next president, and I know it's hard to imagine, isn't it? But Angela Merkel stops being the Chancellor of Germany and is replaced by the ultra-Europhile Herr Schulz. Then the situation will be altogether different from the vantage point of Greece. I must say, I rather wish that the elections were happening in different order, don't you? I'd rather do the Greek one first and then get to the others. But we don't have that option, do we? I wondered what the right slogan was for tonight. How can you follow Make America Great Again? Well, it's easy. We need to make Europe grow again. And the opportunity is clearly there. It's there if those in Northern Europe can abandon the fiscal fetishism that produced austerity as sadomasochism. It's there if we can all understand the urgent need for real structural reform in Southern Europe. The chance, it seems to me, is within our grasp. That reforms not only of Greece, but of the European project can be achieved in the new and very different world that has been created by Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. European leaders, especially those in Germany, but also those in other North European countries, need to stop taking the European project for granted and need to stop defining integration in terms of crude fiscal compacts that make almost no macroeconomic sense, whether you're a Keynesian or not, and I'm certainly not one. If I could see in 2010 that Greece was in a fiscally unsustainable position, I cannot understand for the life of me why nobody thinks differently 7 long years later. So the project, it seems to me, for Europe should be fundamentally the same as the American project. To aim for higher growth, to make that the priority, and to replace the somewhat naive idealism of the previous generation of European leaders with a hard-headed realism that recognizes that ultimately the strength of the European Union is about strong borders, is about effective security, is about free markets, is about the rule of law, is about, I think, all the fundamental principles of a free society that the majority of people in this room hold dear. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time we imagined not just morning in America, but morning in Greece, morning in Europe. It is time we got away from the failed policies that produced the worst financial crisis and economic crisis in this country's modern history. Instead of sneering at Donald Trump, as so many educated Europeans seem to delight in doing, we should take him both literally and seriously and recognize that his disruptive energy and commitment to raising the growth rate and getting real about foreign policy is precisely the kind of approach that we need to take in Europe today. Thank you very much indeed. I'd be delighted to take some questions. How shall we do this? Is it a question of raising hands? There's a gentleman who's very quick off the mark down there.
Yes. Professor Remis, University of Athens, and Elia Mep, Vice President, please. You have microphones. You can have microphones over 2 seats. You can use them, please.
Well, thank you very much for addressing this audience, and I would agree with you that President Trump had a very good product to sell, hence his success in the elections. Very good product indeed, which Hillary did not have, and I agree with you there. Question is, can he deliver? Can he deliver? He doesn't seem to inspire people with confidence. Would you like to have Trump as your father, as your brother, as your mother, or as your husband if you were a woman? I would say no, hence his lack of success so far. He is a totally antagonistic individual. He's a brat, a spoiled brat, born in a house of plenty, smart, streetwise, but it's more than streetwise. And he's a ruffian. He's a ruffian. He doesn't inspire people with confidence. This is my question. Can he deliver all the goodies? Thank you.
The thought of having Donald Trump as my mother or my wife is the most terrifying thought that I've had this week. I mean, I know we're all in favor of same-sex marriage, but I really draw the line at having the Donald next to me in bed. Having said that, let me make two observations. One is that Mr. Trump seems, in fact, to be a very good father. And I think the evidence that he is a good father is compelling. And I've heard this from one of his children, at least, the only one I've met. The second point is that your general comment about his character is one that I can sympathize with. It was one of the reasons that I was hostile to his candidacy last year and hoped that others would become the Republican nominee. I think I ran through about 3 before I gave up and realized there was no stopping him. But you know, the American Constitution does not require the president to be a nice person. It doesn't say in any of the articles, as far as I remember, that the president needs to be a virtuous human being. And that's deliberate, because the founding fathers knew very well that the biggest danger to republicanism was precisely that a demagogue might very likely become the President of the United States. If you don't believe me, read the Federalist Papers, read Hamilton's prediction that a demagogue would become president one day. And that is why they designed the Constitution the way they did, ensuring that the president's powers were limited, were circumscribed by the judiciary and by Congress. Unlike Andrew Sullivan, I don't think the Republic is about to be overthrown and a tyranny proclaimed just because Donald Trump doesn't match up to my expectations of decency in public or private life. It doesn't matter. As we saw within days of his inauguration, the law courts were very well able to strike down a poorly drafted executive order. And what did Trump do? Did he call out the National Guard, arrest the judges and burn the courts to the ground? No. He sucked it up. As he sucked up Michael Flynn's resignation, as he may well have to suck up the departure of Jeff Sessions, whom I see on my phone Paul Ryan has urged to recuse himself. The system works, ladies and gentlemen, and it always has worked because it's the best designed constitution that has ever been devised. So all those people who became hysterical on November the 9th should have taken a chill pill and read the darned Constitution. It's not supposed to be a constitution for saints. The beautiful thing about the American Constitution is that it's designed for sinners to be president, designed to make sure that there are real limits on what those sinners can do. And by the way, Donald Trump is not the first nasty person to be president of the United States. Would you like to meet Lyndon Baines Johnson later? I promise you, Lyndon Johnson was in many ways a worse human being than Donald Trump. And certainly, if one thinks back on the decisions that Johnson made with respect to the Vietnam War, he made one of the worst decisions in American history, despite being a highly experienced politician. Now, maybe Donald Trump will make a decision just that bad, but he hasn't yet. Shall I take another question?
Other questions, please, to exploit Mr. Ferguson.
Gentleman at the back has raised his hand. Yes, sir.
Can you please state your name?
My name is Ethan Kosmopoulos. I'm a techno-legal expert, sir. I fully subscribe to your opinion regarding the populism. We are deeply concerned with this phenomenon in Greece. We have a similar situation. I would like to ask you, given that populism is based on the main pillar of emotion, the voter is dragged by the fear of the future, and he is not thinking logically, what would be the best way to fight back the populism, having in mind that it's very difficult to penetrate the emotional kernel of the average voter with a logical argumentation? Thank you very much.
Thanks for that question. I'm vividly reminded these days of the atmosphere in Britain in the early 1980s, shortly after the election of Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister. I was then an undergraduate at Oxford, and the overwhelming majority of students and professors were in a state of near hysteria that a woman as right-wing as Margaret Thatcher should be Prime Minister. And all the economists, I think without exception, were convinced that the UK economy was finished as a result of her monetarist policies. Margaret Thatcher did some extremely difficult things in her first term as Prime Minister. She addressed some of the profound faults of the British economy of the 1970s, the rampant inflation, the excessive power of the unions, the dysfunctional public sector. And there are, I think, some important lessons, Kyriakos, to be learned from that first Thatcher term. One of the most important lessons is that she was able to do those difficult things based on the principles of Hayek, while at the same time appealing to the emotions of British voters and persuading people who had historically voted Labour, particularly in the southeast of England, to change their political allegiance and give free markets a chance. So it can be done. Reagan did it too. I sat down and listened to Reagan's first inaugural before Trump's because I wanted to see how similar they would be. And what struck me most was Reagan's ability to be genial. There's even a fantastic television address in which Reagan explains to the American people that they are in for an extremely tough time economically. But he somehow does it with a twinkle in his eye, as if he's a country doctor administering a rather unpleasant medicine that's nevertheless going to make the patient recover. So we must learn some lessons from the skilled politicians of the conservative past. My hero, and I think the hero of the whole Western world, Winston Churchill, had the ability to convey conservative principles in language that resonated with the ordinary man and woman in the street. One of the things that I keep urging politicians of my persuasion to do is to do what we used to do so often, and appeal not just to the current needs of the current generation, but to appeal to the interests of future generations, as well as to the traditions of past generations. Edmund Burke said that the real social contract is between the generations, between the dead, the living, and the unborn. That is an appeal that politicians in our time have ceased to make. And yet I know as a father, when I'm trying to assess a political program, I don't just ask myself, what will this do for me in the next 2 or 4 years? I ask, where will this leave my kids and my grandchildren after I'm gone? So there are ways of doing it. And I think when you ask yourself, why did the Liberal candidates lose last year? I can illustrate it with one simple anecdote. I was at a dinner with my good friend Gillian Tett of the Financial Times, who had just been to the 2 conventions. And she asked a strong Clinton supporter, I get what the Trump campaign is about, make America great again, but I can't remember from Philadelphia what the Clinton campaign is actually about. And he replied, well, you obviously haven't read Hillary's 4-point plan to revitalize American infrastructure. And I remember at that point thinking, a 4-point plan is the answer? Then I went to her website, and I discovered that on every single policy issue, the Clinton campaign had a 4, sometimes 5, bullet point document. I downloaded them all. I read them through one Sunday. This must have been September. And at the end of reading those documents through, I said to my wife, I can't face it. I cannot face a Clinton presidency. I've read these documents and I see the future with a ghastly clarity. It's not just more of the same, it's worse. And that was the moment I realized that I preferred the idea of making America great again, even if it was an idea associated with a man with whom I probably have nothing in common except Scottish ancestry. Let's not forget that Donald Trump is half Scottish. Should I take a couple more questions?
One more question from Mr. George Koumoutsakos, MP and Head of Foreign Policy at Nea Demokratia.
There's no micro.
You have a micro behind you, I think.
Just a very short question. Very short question. How did you feel? What did you think when Politico, CNN, New York Times, BuzzFeed were excluded by the briefings of White House? And what did you feel when the correspondents of Time boycotted the briefings of White House?
I thought, let's not conclude from this battle that the Republic is in danger. Because there have been similar battles between presidents and the press before. And I should remind you all that the last time a battle like this occurred, the press won. That battle began in 1969 when Richard Nixon wrote in the margin of a presidential briefing, "The press is the enemy." And Nixon set about a pitched battle with the New York Times and the Washington Post that was to rage for the rest of his presidency, and you know how that ended. One of the things that's most impressive about the liberal press is the way that it has so far been able to spin the first weeks of the Trump presidency as an assault on civil liberties, when it is in fact essentially a challenge to the power of those institutions. So don't, I think, jump to the conclusion that we should all feel tremendously sorry for the New York Times. The New York Times has enjoyed a privileged access, as has the Washington Post, to the corridors of power for so long they think it's in the Constitution. It's not. My warning to Donald Trump is this. Number one, there's nothing you can do that can override the First Amendment. Two, if you pick a fight with the American press the way Richard Nixon did, they will get you. And therefore, what we're seeing, I think, is rather like the collision that we saw between the president and the law courts in the very first weeks of the presidency. I remember after the courts ruled against the executive order on my way home, humming a tune to myself that I remembered from my young days. It's a tune that goes like this. I fought the law and the law won. President Trump fought the law and the law won. Right now he's fighting the press. I'm afraid if he carries on that fight, the press will win too. And in that sense, I remain an optimist about the resilience of the American system. My hope is, and I'll conclude with this reflection, that the president is a fast learner and has realized pretty quickly that there are some fights you don't win. He backed off on the law courts. He backed off on China. He's pretty much backed off in his fight with Paul Ryan, who I think, as I mentioned earlier, is essentially prime minister. And my hunch is that ultimately he will have to back off from this fight with the press. The only reason that it continues, in my view, is that there are those in the administration who think that it works as a way of reassuring the base in the heartland that Donald Trump is really shaking things up. And I can assure you that when you ask people in the heartland, in Montana, where I just was, what they think of President Trump's first 6 weeks, one of the things they really like about Donald Trump is that the New York Times really hates him. Don't underestimate the importance of that as a tool of political mobilization. Ladies and gentlemen, I've tried my best to be contrarian tonight. I'm sure to some European ears it will seem strange to hear Donald Trump defended. But I think it's very good to remind Europeans that they often underestimate new presidents. And if you don't believe me, go back and look at how the European press covered the first year of Ronald Reagan's presidency. Donald Trump is no Ronald Reagan. But it doesn't really matter. It's not one man, or one day it'll be one woman, who runs the United States. It's an administration. It's the Congress. It's the full Constitution that governs. And that's why I remain incorrigibly an optimist about the United States. And I hope, too, an optimist about Greece and Europe. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Professor Ferguson. Thank you all for being with us tonight. Have a good night.